erosion sediment control, and dewatering and groundwater and wells. So today, thanks for joining us to talk about our new wetlands and stream regulations. These were issued as emergency regulations in October, and Jen will explain to you the background and reasoning for that and all the information about the new regulations. So I just want to thank and introduce Jen Dietzen, who is our wetlands program lead, who will provide the presentation and give you all the good technical information today, and Stephanie Pappas, who organized our meeting and is the recipient of all the chat questions and will help us coordinate everything. So also want to add that you know, it may come as a surprise to some that these were issued as emergency regulations, but once you hear the background on the changes to the Clean Water Act and or Waters of the U.S. and other rules this year, I hope you'll come to understand why we had to issue these as emergency regulations, but they are in draft form, but are effective currently. And we are accepting comments through December 16th. And at that point, we will review the comments, make any changes we may need to, reissue them in draft if we need to, or reissue them as final, or we may extend the emergency period if needed. So with that, please feel free to put your questions in the chat as Jen is going through the presentation, and we'll answer those as we go or at the end as appropriate. So thanks. It's good to see a lot of participants today. And with that, I will turn it over to Jen.
Thanks, Meredith. I hope everyone had a nice Thanksgiving. Meredith, can you let me know when you can see my screen? Awesome. Thanks. Okay. So like Meredith said, we are within the Regulatory Review Division, and underneath the Regulatory Review Division, the Water Resources Plan Review and Flood Control Branch, which is actually led by Nick Bernard, who couldn't make it today for good reason. He's on paternity leave. So today I'm going to go over kind of a two-part presentation. The first is really just explaining the emergency rulemaking and overall the kind of key regulatory requirements that were included in our regulations. So that'll be the first part. The second part has to deal a little bit more with the permit application requirements and how to apply. I'll also give a demonstration, a very quick demonstration on how to use our new surface and groundwater system to submit applications. So to start, like Meredith mentioned, we did do an emergency rulemaking. The regulations were published on October 16th, and we're accepting public comments until December 16th. I'll include our email address at the end of this in case you don't have it already. So initially, you know, we were drafting regulations for the last 2 years in response to the mayor's signing of the Fisheries and Wildlife Omnibus Act. And you may recall, some of you may have been involved earlier this spring. We actually had some public information sessions similar to this on our draft rulemaking. We actually moved to an emergency rulemaking once the navigable waters rule really became a reality this summer. So in June of this year, the EPA released their navigable waters rule. And essentially what that did is it redefined waters of the United States. So what streams and wetlands are jurisdictional to the Army Corps in our case. Really what happened with the navigable waters rule is a lot of our all of our ephemeral streams and many of our wetlands in the district lost that federal jurisdiction. And since we relied on the Clean Water Act sections 404 and 401 to regulate district wetlands and streams. We had to really make some quick changes to ensure there wasn't a gap in regulatory protection between that draft rulemaking we were working on and this new navigable waters rule. So really that's the main driving force behind this emergency rulemaking was closing that regulatory gap to make sure our wetlands and streams weren't really vulnerable to unregulated dredging and filling. So we issued chapters 26 and 25 of our DCMR, which are critical areas regulations and the wetlands and streams, and I'll explain that in a second. But as Meredith mentioned, they are effective now. And again, our public comment period ends December 16th, so please get those comments into us. Before we go into the regulatory requirements, I just wanted to take a few quick minutes to kind of define what we are actually regulating. I'm sure most of you are familiar with what a wetland is and what a stream is, but I just think it's important to make sure we're clear. I do know a lot of folks in the industry tend to confuse wetlands with streams, so I just want to make clear, what we're talking about here. And this slide actually shows the definition that we used in our regulations for wetlands, and it is the same as the Army Corps' definition. So I think that's important for everyone to know. We're not reinventing the definition or the wheel here. We're using the same definition that's always been used by the Army Corps and DOE. So wetlands come in all types and sizes. They have, sometimes visible water, like you can see on the left here, and on the right, some wetlands never have visible water, which can frustrate folks, especially, if you have a parcel of land and you think everything is fine, you've never seen water there, and then you come to find out there's a wetland. So, just beware that not all wetlands have water that is visible to the human eye. Sometimes the water is just under the surface. So that's really the main takeaway I have with this slide. I could go on and on about how many different types of wetlands there are in the district. But I think it's just really important to know they are diverse and sometimes not easy to identify. Another kind of term I think everyone should be familiar with, since it's used throughout our regulations, is aquatic resource functions. These are essentially the functions that are provided by wetlands for both humans and wildlife. The list that's provided on this particular slide is by no means a full list of all the aquatic resource functions that a wetland could provide. These are just kind of the main examples that I think most people tend to use. So for example, of a function, wetlands kind of act as natural flood regulators by storing flood water and rainwater and slowly releasing that water either downstream or allowing it to infiltrate into the ground. So during heavy rains, wetlands that are specifically depressional areas can really slow down surface runoff and retain runoff, which is really an important function when you think about the district and being in a highly urban environment. We all know there's a lot of stormwater issues and requirements in the district, so we have these natural flood regulators already doing that job for us here in the district. So that's just one example of an aquatic resource function. I just wanted you to be aware, that these terms are used kind of throughout the regulations. And for a very brief history, kind of to understand the driving force behind our wetland conservation plan and our regulations. Until the 18th century, we had extensive marshes and swamp areas all along the Potomac River, from above Rock Creek confluence down to Haynes Point. The Anacostia River was twice its width and supported hundreds of acres of wetlands that were really dominated by wild rice and submerged aquatic vegetation. So from the 1800s to the mid-1900s, wetlands in the district were significantly reduced. by colonial agricultural practices, dump sites, urbanization in general, draining, dredging, something called land reclamation that involved dredging the rivers and placing that dredge material in the tidal flats. A lot of the reason behind that was actually to eliminate breeding grounds for mosquitoes that carried malaria. But it turns out we did not eradicate the mosquitoes in the district, which I can definitely tell you from personal experience. This is just another cool picture we pulled from the Library of Congress. You can see memorial right there. Really, what I want you to know is that we've had a lot of wetland loss in the district. And the Army Corps estimates that we had approximately 2,500 acres of tidal emergent wetlands that have been destroyed in the Anacostia River, just between Bladensburg and the Anacostia's confluence with the Potomac River. Based on our recent wetland inventory that we performed in 2016 of district wetlands, there are only approximately 169 tidal wetlands left. So we went from 2,500 acres to about 169. So like I mentioned, in 2016, we did a wetland inventory in the district. And really what that involved was going, on foot around the entire district, trying to map every wetland that we thought existed. And we think we did a good job. I think we captured about 92% of the possible wetlands. You might be asking why we didn't capture them all. There's definitely some landowner restrictions and access restrictions, and just the possibility that, we didn't cover every inch of the district. So you might have seen this spring, we released our wetland conservation plan update. And why I'm mentioning this is, the wetland conservation plan is really one of the big driving forces behind our regulations. And that's because it all revolves around this goal of no net loss of wetland acreage and functions and eventual net gain. So really that's the main reason why I'm mentioning it here today. And it's available on our website. It's very lengthy. It's a great read. But really just want you to know that we have this overarching goal in our wetland conservation plan. And that's a nationwide goal. Every state has this goal of no net loss and eventual net gain. One of the other outcomes of this wetland conservation plan update is our wetland registry and geodatabase, which I think is going to be really useful for anyone who's planning a project, whether it's for wetland restoration or development. Really what this is an interactive database, again, available on our website, that has all the data we collected during that 2016 inventory. And I will caveat it by saying, it's a great tool, but by no means do the boundaries on that registry, are they final boundaries, right? Wetland boundaries tend to shift over time. So any project that might involve wetland impacts is still going to require that site-specific wetland delineation where boundaries are flagged and mapped. But the wetland registry is going to be, I think, a great tool for planning. Again, from our wetland inventory, we collected a lot of data. There's a lot of numbers on this slide. They might be interesting to some, but the main takeaway from this slide is really, that we found most of our wetlands are very small. 76% are less than half an acre in size, and even 66% are less than a quarter acre. Really what that means is, we have a lot of, I think 291 individual wetlands, but the cumulative total of all our district wetlands is only 289 acres. All of our wetlands are located within 500 feet or less of a development. And by development, we could mean a roadway, infrastructure, a building, anything that has to do with an urban setting. And the reason I mention this is, we talked earlier about aquatic resource functions. One of the other driving forces behind having our own district wetland streaming regulations was really to address the fact that all of our wetlands are within an entirely urban watershed. And we are unique when it comes to that. Most states, all states have some rural aspect or land in them where, either mitigation can occur or there might be higher functioning wetlands that they could focus on for management. In the district, all of our wetlands are in the city, which really isn't a shock. But to look at it from a different perspective, all of our wetlands, although they might be stressed from being within that proximity to development, they also have the ability to significantly serve one or a few of those aquatic resource functions that I mentioned earlier. So for example, we could have a wetland that's serving that stormwater retention function right here in the district, which would be a lot more significant than a wetland perhaps out in the middle of the forest. So our urban wetlands actually have the opportunity to serve one or two very significant functions, which is great. But we also have that goal of functional uplift from the Wetland Conservation Plan. And last in our Wetland and Stream 101, I promise I'm almost done with this. A wetland and a stream are two different things. And I just want to be clear that, a stream is a channel or a conveyance of surface water. And streams are classified as either perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral. And it's important to understand when we're talking about the district's wetland and stream regulations that all streams are going to be regulated. So whether it's an ephemeral stream or a perennial stream, the district will regulate that. And the reason why is, we recognize best available science that, all streams individually or cumulatively exert a strong influence on downstream waters. So although ephemeral streams may be very small, they may be dry most of the time, they're still biologically, chemically, or physically connected to those downstream waters. So, think the Anacostia River or the Potomac River or even the Chesapeake Bay. Each ephemeral stream still exerts an influence on those larger waters. So when you're in the district, even if the Army Corps is not going to regulate ephemeral streams, DOEE will still regulate them. Okay, moving on. So like I mentioned, the first main topic I really wanted to go over was just the regulatory requirements that we've included that might be more significant or key regulatory requirements that aren't kind of standard that you would have seen before. So like I mentioned, the Fisheries and Wildlife Omnibus Act designated all wetlands and streams as critical areas to be regulated. What's important to know here, and I really want to drive this point home, is that we are regulating all wetlands and streams regardless of whether the federal government does, but that doesn't mean you're going to have to necessarily get 2 permits. So if, for example, if you have a project that's going to impact a water of the United States, then just like we've always done, you will only need a water quality certification from DOE. You won't need a water quality certification and a wetland and stream permit. The wetland and stream permit is really only meant to close that gap whenever there is no federal jurisdiction. So you're either going to need a wetland and stream permit or a water quality certification. The only difference is really going to be what piece of paper or electronic file you get at the end. Our application requirements are going to be the same, and our review is going to be the same. So don't want you to be scared that there's going to be 2 permits. The only driving factor between which piece of paper you essentially get is whether or not the Army Corps has claimed jurisdiction. And I'll talk about that again a little bit more. But the key regulatory requirements that I'm going to go over today are water dependency analysis, our avoidance and minimization requirements, mitigation fees, our wetlands of special concern designation, and then our public notice requirements. So to start, when we receive an application, one of the first questions we're going to be asking is this a water dependent project? And really what that means is, does the project require water access for its basic project purpose? For example, putting in a boat dock that absolutely requires water access. So that's the really first question we're going to be asking. And if, once we look at the project and the justification, it's determined that a project is not water dependent, we're going to kind of move on to this analysis of practicable alternatives, which isn't something new. The Army Corps does the same thing too. It's just, I think we're clarifying what our process is in these regulations and providing more transparency, which is a great thing. So when we're looking at an analysis of practical alternatives, we're really asking a few questions. The first is, can the basic project purpose be accomplished using a different site instead of impacting a wetland or impacting a stream? If that's not possible, we start to kind of zoom out and ask more questions. We'll look at the parcel of land. Is there can you achieve your project purpose in the same general area, but not necessarily in the wetland? And this is kind of the same as our avoidance and minimization analysis. They kind of jive. We'll also be looking, to see if maybe there can be a reduction in the size of the footprint of the project or the configuration of the project. This is very similar to like a NEPA EA, where you have to look at alternative sites, including a no action alternative. And I've included the section here, section 2605, in our regulations so that you can kind of reference it and go back and maybe look at this in more detail. So really what we're doing is, we're asking two questions. Is this a water dependent feature for a project? If it's not, are there any practicable alternatives? And if it's determined that it is a water dependent feature, then we'll move on to our avoidance and minimization section. If it's determined that there are practicable alternatives, then we'll ask the applicant to go back and reconsider their project. So permits are only going to be issued for sites that have determined, or projects that have been determined to have no practicable alternative, or projects that are water dependent. So like I mentioned, moving on after we've done this practicable alternatives and water dependency questioning, we'll be looking at your avoidance and minimization analysis. And I'm pretty excited to have these regulations and again, have a clear process for folks, because a lot of times what we see are projects coming in that have done some planning and come up with a mitigation project. But the problem is they've forgotten that avoidance and minimization step. And avoidance and minimization are not steps that can be skipped. So I really like this slide because it really drives home the fact that you need to first, show avoidance and first try to avoid those wetland and stream impacts. Then if you can't avoid those wetland and stream impacts, you still have to go through and try to minimize them. An example of minimization would be reconfiguring your limits of disturbance on site. So maybe instead of just, plopping a whole project on top of a wetland, can you just impact maybe the peripheral edges of the wetland? Or can you move your project around to have the least amount of impact to the wetland or stream? Then as a last resort, we look at and require mitigation for those unavoidable impacts. So it's important to know, that we're going to be looking for this avoidance and minimization, and it'll need to be demonstrated. So we'll need justification essentially for your impacts that you're proposing. And again, similar to that analysis of practicability, we're going to be looking at if it's possible to modify the size or scope and the density of the project. And looking at practicability, we're also going to take into consideration any site constraints you might have, like zoning, access, existing infrastructure. So all that's kind of taken into consideration. And again, if you can confine the impacts to like the fringe of a wetland, for example. So then once you've gone through and proven that impacts were avoided as best they could be and minimized to the greatest extent practicable, then mitigation is required. And this is where we're going back to the wetland conservation plan of no net loss and eventual net gain of both wetland acreage and function. So mitigation is required to offset, functional losses, but also temporal losses and permanent losses. And I'll explain that in a second here. So our requirements for mitigation are very complex, and I encourage you to go through the regulations and really read through them. It would take me an hour just to go through all of this with you, but I think the main points are really, what we're looking for, and very similar to the Army Corps, is avoiding temporal loss and permanent loss of wetlands and streams. And temporal is referring to time. So to address that, we're requiring mitigation at least a 1-to-1 ratio for projects that can provide mitigation at the same time that wetland impacts occur. So that's avoiding that temporal loss. And 1-to-1 is only for projects that replace those lost functions in kind. So an example is, you have a site where you impact a wetland that's providing, let's just use that stormwater retention function and perhaps habitat for species of greatest conservation need. If you can restore that wetland or create a wetland on site at the same time that your project is occurring, so when construction's occurring, and recreate that wetland the way that it was, then you're looking at a 1-to-1 ratio. Once we start looking at projects that might not replace those functions in kind or exactly, then you start looking at a higher ratio. Similarly, if mitigation cannot be provided at the time or around the time that impacts are taken, then that's considered temporal loss. So the ratio is higher when there's a time gap. So if it's going to be a year or two before, say you create a wetland or restore a wetland, then the ratio is higher to account for that temporal loss. And this is similar to other states. Maryland does something similar. The Army Corps also, has this standard 1-to-1 ratio for functional in-kind replacement. And then once you start looking at temporal loss or functional loss, the ratio gets higher. So like I said, I encourage you to look at sections 2607, 2608 to really go through this and digest it, but I'm still going to try to walk you through it here. Similar to the Army Corps, we have 4 methods of mitigation that are available. And in order of preference, we have it listed here. Obviously, the first preferred method is going to be recreating what was lost. So creation is our first, preference. The next is restoration, and then enhancement, and then preservation. There is an option, to be flexible and have projects that might include some creation, some restoration, and some preservation. So any combination of these is certainly an option, and we are absolutely open to having that discussion. Recognizing that the district is very unique, our resources are very small, and we really don't see that many wetland impacts occur on a yearly basis. So it's very possible to have a conversation, and the Army Corps does a very similar thing where you can do a combination of these methods. As far as mitigation sites go, we have, again, similar preferences to the Army Corps. And this is driven by that goal of no net loss. So our first preference for a mitigation site is for an applicant to replace that lost wetland or that lost stream function on site where the impacts occurred. If that's not possible, and we'll go through a justification period to look at whether or not that's possible, then we'll start to essentially zoom out. Can you do mitigation within the same drainage basin? That's the next question we'll ask, and then zoom out further. Can you do it just within the watershed? One of the takeaways I want you to have from the slide is really, we'll zoom out as far as within the district boundaries. So all mitigation for wetland and stream impacts has to occur within the district. But again, we'll look at mitigation sites in the order of preference provided here. And this is again driven by that wetland conservation plan goal of no net loss of district wetlands. There are two available mitigation mechanisms in the district. Similar to the Army Corps' preference. Well, actually, the Army Corps, their number one preference is mitigation banks, and we don't have mitigation banks in the district. So the next mechanism that's preferred is permittee responsible. And as we have highlighted here, our preferred option is permittee responsible mitigation on site. Again, replacing exactly those functions in the acreage of what was lost. The second option is payment into essentially our in-fee fund. It's important to understand that our district and wetland stream trust fund is not an Army Corps approved in-fee program. So what that means is if you impact a water of the United States, payment into this fund is not going to satisfy the Army Corps' mitigation requirement, but it will satisfy our mitigation requirement. So essentially, this is our second mechanism and our least preferred, right? The other kind of spin on this that I'll explain a little bit too is there still has to be justification provided for proposing payment into the district's wetland and stream trust fund. And it's important to understand that, this payment is really taking into consideration that temporal loss that we talked about earlier. So the mitigation ratios will be higher for projects that propose payment into this trust fund. So a little more detail about the trust fund, or you could call it the in lieu fee fund. I encourage you to look at section 2611 to really get an understanding of what is required to pay into this fund or propose to pay into this fund. But I want to be certain that you understand that it's not a substitute for avoidance and minimization. So a project can't just come into DOE and say, I want to impact this wetland and here's a check. We're still going to go through that same process, looking at water dependency, an analysis of practicability, and that avoidance and minimization analysis. So this is not an option to just write a check and move on with the project. It's really a last resort. The payments are calculated based on the realistic cost for DOE, the district, to implement a mitigation project in lieu of the permittee. So like I mentioned, that takes into account the temporal loss because, DOE is probably not going to implement mitigation at the same time that your project is occurring. But also it, takes into consideration the cost of land and acquiring land in the district, and all of the scope items that you would see for a permitting responsible mitigation project. And again, this is not an Army Corps approved program. Another provision that we included in our wetland and stream regulations is this less than 2,500 square foot threshold for single projects. What that means is, we really looked at what would be a viable mitigation project for impacts that are so small. For example, a project that's only going to impact 100 square feet. Expecting someone to perform a mitigation on site for 100 square feet might not actually produce a very viable project or an ecologically significant project. So really what we did is, took a good hard look at, what we thought would be a good threshold for those small projects where permitting responsible mitigation might not be either a realistic option or really produce a viable project. So our take on this is, those really, really small projects that have unavoidable impacts can pay into the fee fund rather than being expected to do permitting responsible mitigation on site for those very small impacts. So again, please check out 2611, I think, for more detail. Moving on, we have fees for our wetland and stream permits and water quality certifications, which is a new requirement. This isn't something we had before. Section 2604 includes all of our fees. There are 3 tables included that I'll go over right here. So we will have just application fees based on whether or not the project is a minor certification or major certification modification, whether or not you've asked UEE to perform a presence absence survey during planning, which I'll talk about in a minute, and just a standard 750 fee essentially for either water quality certifications or wetland and stream permits. The second table is based on the size of the permit or project and what those proposed impacts are. And this fee table is very similar to Maryland's Department of the Environment. They have a similar fee structure that is based on the area of proposed impact. The only thing we've done here with Maryland's fee structure is we've essentially shifted our fee up by 1. And that's to really address the reality that most of our projects and most of our wetlands are less than half an acre and less than a quarter acre. So to address the reality of the projects that we often see come in our door, we had to kind of shift the fee structure there. So these first 2 tables, the initial application fee and the impact area fee, can be paid online whenever you submit your application. And I'll show you that when I do the demonstration. But similar to how our stormwater database, fees and permit fees can be paid online, the same is going to happen here. So hopefully that's easy for everyone. And then we have additional fees depending on the complexity of the project. For example, if it was, we dealt with a lot of contamination, or if the project requires permitting responsible mitigation. And this might sound strange at first, but really this again is to cover the cost of our staff for projects that really are going to go on for 5 to 10 years. So any mitigation project is going to involve at least 5 years of DOE staff time and obviously your consultant or whoever does the work. So these fees were based on that monitoring period, the reporting period, construction oversight, and to address administrative requirements during those 5 to 10 years of monitoring and reporting for mitigation sites. These fees will be added on if we get to the end of the project review and it's determined that either permitting responsible mitigation is required or that there was, again, contamination, significant contamination we had to deal with. And there'll be a notification online in our surface and groundwater system to let you know that these fees are required. And I'll go over that in a little bit. Another key regulatory requirement that we included in our regulations was this designation of wetlands of special concern. Again, this is similar to Maryland Department of the Environment's wetlands of special state concern. Really, these are unique areas containing ecologically significant communities or habitat. And a map of the wetlands that we've proposed to designate as wetlands of special concern is available on our website. I will say most or nearly all of these wetlands are located on National Park Service land. And there's really two main requirements associated with proposed impacts to wetlands of special concern. The first is an immediate higher mitigation ratio. So the other is functional replacement. And the reason behind that is twofold. One, we're again looking at this no net loss of wetland acreage and function, but also, addressing the fact that these are unique areas. These might have been identified as conservation opportunity areas in the district's wildlife action plan. They might be spring-fed wetlands, which are very rare in the district, or tidal wetlands, which again, we had a slide very earlier about how few tidal wetlands we have left. And those are just examples of some of the wetlands of special concern. But again, there'll be higher mitigation ratios for impacts that are proposed to these wetlands, and mitigation has to replace those lost functions. And the last key regulatory requirement is a public notice. So if you look at section 2612, before we issue a water quality certification or a wetland and stream permit, the department is going to issue a public notice for the intent to issue a water quality certification or wetland and stream permit, and provide the opportunity for the public to request a hearing. We may provide a public comment period if it's a large, complex project, and DOE will determine when a public comment period would really be in the public interest. And the duration of the public notice and public comment period is determined by DOE, again, based on the complexity of the project. So our public notices will be given by either a joint notice with federal agencies in the Federal Register, publication in the DC Register, or at least one business day in a daily newspaper that is circulated throughout the district. So again, check out 2612 for these requirements. And that concludes the first kind of section of my presentation. Moving on, we're really going to talk about the nuts and bolts of our application requirements and how to apply for wetland stream permit or water quality certification. And I really want to focus on project planning. I think project planning really will help with the avoidance and minimization aspect of our permitting and regulatory requirements. So I'm going to talk about some tools that are available to assist in project planning to really, again, like I said, hone in on that avoidance and minimization. And then I'll give a quick demo on how to use our surface and groundwater system to submit an application. I think this slide is really important for everyone to burn into their brains. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that we aren't requiring, we aren't having a duplicate permitting requirement here. So if you propose impacts to a wetland or stream in the district, and those wetlands or streams are waters of the United States, similar to what has always been required, you will need to go get an Army Corps Section 404 permit and a DOE 401 water quality certification. If you propose impacts to wetlands and streams and those waters are not waters of the United States, which a lot of folks often refer to as isolated wetlands or streams, then a DOE wetland and stream permit will be required. Again, the permit requirements, the application requirements, the regulatory requirements will be the same regardless of whether it's a 401 or a wetland and stream permit. It really just comes down to the jurisdictional determination and what piece of paper you get at the end. Like I mentioned in our wetland conservation plan update, we have this new wetland registry that's available on our website. And it includes a map of nearly all the district's wetlands. And I hope it'll be a great tool for project planning. If you click on a specific wetland, you can actually see all the data that we collected in the field, including functional assessments, photographs, soils information, hydrology information, vegetation. We do have a streamlet layer included in this registry to help, again, with project planning. But I will caveat all of this by saying that this is by no means an entirely inclusive map. There may be wetlands that are on a piece of property that don't show up on this map. The wetland boundaries might be slightly different than what appears here because wetland boundaries tend to shift over time. And there may be stream channels that, are located on a certain piece of property that aren't pictured on this map. So the take home here is, this is going to be a great planning tool. I think it is way more up to date than, the National Wetland Inventory map. It has a lot more detail, but it does not replace the need to do site-specific wetland delineations and stream delineations when a project is actually going to occur. So for project planning, in September of this year, the EPA and Army Corps released their new Clean Water Act Section 401 regulations. The 401 regulations are available on EPA's website, but the one thing I want you to know as far as project planning goes is now a 30-day, prior to submitting your 401 application, 30 days before that, you have to request what's called a pre-application meeting, which we're always in favor of anyway. I think it's great to meet as early and often as you can to talk about projects before they get too far down the road that avoidance and minimization become more of an issue. So that Clean Water Act Section 401, the new regulations require you to request a pre-application meeting 30 days before you submit that water quality certification application. And I would say, similarly, if you're going to be submitting a wetland and stream permit, which you might not know, before you submit the application, whether or not you're getting a water quality certification and wetland and stream permit, pre-application meetings are something we are absolutely always open to and encourage. Similarly, DOEE is now going to offer, and by no means is DOEE the only entity capable of doing this, but we're really encouraging presence absence surveys. And that's, again, to help with the avoidance and minimization aspect of our regulatory requirements. So maybe you're going to purchase a property and you really just want to know if a wetland or stream is on your site. That's really all a presence and absence survey is having someone who's qualified to do wetland and stream delineations come out to your property and say, yes, you have a wetland, or yes, you have a stream. This is, a quick walkthrough of a site to literally just answer those questions. We're not flagging boundaries, which is absolutely something we couldn't do anyway. We're not going to, go out there and map anything. We're just saying, yes, you have something here. This is, I'm sure, something that environmental consultants also offer. But I just want to be aware, we are absolutely willing to do this as well. It's just to encourage that avoidance and minimization. And again, this doesn't replace the need to further on down the line do a site-specific wetland and stream delineation where boundaries are flagged and a report is generated. And that is not something DOEE would do. Again, this is just going out and saying, yes, there is a wetland on your property. And, for this presence absence survey, I think you saw in our fee tables, there is a small fee associated with requesting a presence absence survey. For project planning, like I mentioned, prior to submitting a wetland and stream permit application or a water quality certification application, a wetland and stream delineation and report is required. It's required not only by DOEE, but also by the Army Corps. And we are not looking for something new. We are just asking for the same Army Corps method with the regional supplements. But we are, requiring boundaries to actually be flagged on site. And then that report is generated, which is standard for the Army Corps. Moving on, jurisdictional determinations are certainly required by the Army Corps and also required by us. And for us, this is necessary to determine just whether or not you're going to get that water quality certification or a wetland and stream permit. The last thing we would want is for you to come to us and forget to go to the Army Corps and find out later that this was a water in the United States. So this is something you should plan to do early on in your project planning. Get that jurisdictional determination to find out who and which agencies you have to coordinate with. And I don't want to scare you. We're not asking for a formal jurisdictional determination. However you would want to go about it is fine with us. We really just need a decision document from the Army Corps. So you could do that standard preliminary JD or get the formal jurisdictional determination. Really all we're looking for is documentation that the Army Corps has said either yes, this is a water of the United States, or no, it is not. If you look at 2602, we clearly outlined all of the application documents that are required for either a wetland and stream permit, again, or a water quality certification. These are standard application documents, very similar to the Army Corps. I think it's important to understand, when you look at this list, it's very exhaustive. If you have a really straightforward project that isn't going to require all these documents, we are also not going to require these documents. So, we could get, for example, a project that might involve significant wetland impacts associated with, say, permanent development, where we also on the same day could get a project that involves just sediment sampling in the river. And those are two very different situations. So very different documents will be required. The documents that are pretty standard are the ones that are listed here. So a project description, wetland and stream delineation report, like I mentioned, that Army Corps jurisdictional decision document, by all means an avoidance and minimization analysis. And I think it's also important to understand that we're using the Army Corps' joint permit application form. So this is the same form that you've always used. It's available on Baltimore's Army Corps' regulatory site. And it actually says Maryland in the form, but it is also the district's form for Army Corps permits. And instead of inventing the wheel and confusing the application process, we're just looking for that same application form, regardless of whether it's a wetland and stream permit or a water quality certification. That's also because when you submit this application form, you might not necessarily know if it's a water in the United States or not. So same application form, no matter which type of permit you get. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick demonstration of how to apply for a wetland stream permit or water quality certification. And this is using our, let me change screens here, surface and groundwater system, which is actually just an updated version, I believe, of our stormwater database. Let me share this here. Meredith, can you let me know if you can see that?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so like I mentioned, you might be familiar with our stormwater database. The surface and groundwater system is just a revamped version of the stormwater database and newly renamed. There are instructions step-by-step of how to create a user account to use this, what we call SGS. Or, there's also step-by-step how to apply instructions on our district wetland and stream DOE website. So, if you have any questions and need to go through this again, you can either refer to that on our website or absolutely give us a call and we can walk you through this. I think it's important to know that if I can use this, anybody can do it. So that's why I did not ask someone from our database group to do this demo for you, because I want to give you all confidence. So when you sign into SGS, this is the homepage that you'll get, and you'll want to click on Wetland and Stream Permit Applications. And the first page that pops up will really just generate a report of any projects that you might have submitted in the past. And this is, again, similar to maybe how you've submitted stormwater applications. So you can click and look at any of the projects that you've submitted to see if someone has commented on them. But I'll go back once I've shown you how to submit. But really, this is just a dashboard to look at any projects you might have submitted. But hang on a second here. So to submit a new application, very easy, just click new application. And the page that shows up is the only page you will have to deal with. So there are not multiple pages, it's just this page. And really it's just a way for you to upload all of the documents that are required. We'll ask you to submit a little bit of data about your site location and your personal information, your consultant's information, however you want to do it. So you'll submit a very brief project summary. For example, I'm going to do a wetland restoration project. To enter your site location information, you can just drag and drop a pin on your site instead of entering a site address. And we did that because a lot of times your site is going to fall in the center of a water body. So, we have a lot of projects that occur in the middle of the river, and the river does not have an address. So I hope this is easier for everyone, that you can just really drop a point and show us where your project is going to occur. Moving on, just to get an idea of what your project's going to entail, we ask you to check, one or a few of these boxes. If you get it wrong, it's okay. We're definitely going to go through it and check all this, but it's really just to give us an idea. If you have a project that's going to involve something that wasn't included on this list, you can add it. After you've submitted your project application, the reviewer will come back and essentially click later on to tell you whether or not this project will require mitigation. And that's because you might not know when you originally submit the application. So here you'll enter your project or your consultant's information, your applicant's information, so we have a way to contact you. And then this is the most important part here. I have to save and close this, hang on. All of the application documents that are required, you will add right here. And we've gone through and included a menu of what is typically required for projects so that you can label each document as you upload it, and you'll be able to upload it right here. If you've failed to submit a certain document, we'll certainly notify you and make sure that your application is complete. Okay. This box, the Clean Hands certificate, is something that we are now requiring. I think most folks are probably familiar with this if they've had to apply for a different permit from DOE or DCRA. And there is a whole section of our website that explains what a Clean Hands certificate is. Essentially, what it means is that you don't owe the district government money. So we are going to make sure that you submit this Clean Hands certificate. And we will verify to make sure that you have. So once you've submitted it and we've received it, we will check this box. Once you've submitted your application, you will receive an email essentially saying you've successfully submitted it. And then, throughout the life of your project review, any comments or questions that the reviewer might have will show up in this status box. Similarly, the reviewer will notify you what fees are required for your project, and those will also pop up right here. So, talking back and forth with your permit reviewer will occur right here. By no means does this have to be the only way you can communicate with DOE. This is really just an effort to keep a database of all permit applications and good record keeping for all of our projects. You are very welcome to call us and email us, as always, to go over any questions you might have, to schedule a permit or pre-application meeting, anything like that. So that's not going to change. Similarly, if you go through all this and still have a hard time either submitting an application or paying a fee, just feel free to call us. We will certainly walk you through the first time you use this new surface and groundwater system. And that is all for my demo. Can you let me see if you can see my slide again, Meredith?
Not yet.
Okay. Hang on, sorry. Really, that's the end of my presentation. And I will throw up my contact information here for both your questions and, the public comment period information as well. Sorry, hang on here. Okay.
Yep, see it now.
Okay, so next steps, like we mentioned, the public comment period ends December 16th. Please send your comments to this wetland program at dc.gov email address. Our emergency rulemaking is effective for 120 days from when we publish them. So that puts us at mid-February for that 121 days to be up. Once we've gotten to the end of our 120 days, we will address those public comments, and either issue another draft emergency rulemaking to ensure there is no regulatory gap, or a final rulemaking will be issued within that 120 days. And here's my contact information. If you have any questions about anything I presented today, or you read through the regulations and want to talk through them, I'm absolutely happy to answer any of your questions. So feel free to reach out. Feel free to give me a call, send me an email. I can talk about wetlands any day. And that's all I have. I'm sure there's probably some questions that have popped up. So Stephanie, if you could help me out.
Yeah, no problem. So we had a few questions. I think what we'll do is we'll do the chat box questions first, and some of them have responses. I'll just make sure that everybody sees the questions and the responses, and then we can open it up to if there's any other questions that haven't been addressed yet. The first one is, will we be able to get a copy of the presentation in PDF format to keep and use as references? Yes, we will send out the presentation after this meeting. Let's see. Are other district agencies subject to DOE fees? Yes, district agencies are required to pay permit review fees, the same as for stormwater management and erosion and sediment control fees. We had a question about, this is for the database, who fills out the application? The owner is federal government, but we have AEs obtaining the permits.
Good question. I would encourage you to have either your consultants or whomever you've hired to actually obtain the permits fill out the application. By no means are we going to deny a permit application if the federal government or an owner filled out the permit. It's really just establishing who's going to be our main point of contact. So whomever you want to deal with DOEE and ask these questions and go through the permit application process is really who should fill out that permit application.
Next question. If a project impacts both core jurisdictional waters of the U.S., i.e. a perennial channel, and DOE jurisdictional resources, i.e. an ephemeral channel, would only a WQC be required, or would you also need a WSP? And I believe you said that just the WQC would be required. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no. You're getting close, Stephanie. Listen to so many of these. Thanks for asking this question. I'm actually really glad you did because I meant to mention this in my presentation. So yes, there will certainly come a time where a project is going to impact, maybe a water United States and a non-water United States. We will issue, it will be very clear in the document or the permit that you get, impact one, for example, is going to be authorized by a water quality certification, and say maybe impact two is authorized by that wetland and stream permit. So we will list out your impacts and which ones are authorized by which type of permit. Regardless, it will be one piece of paper that you get at the end. So I hope that answers your question.
And then the other one we had was the wetlands data in the DC Atlas Plus website seems to correspond to the NWI data. Is this going to be updated in the future to show the data in the Wetland Registry geodatabase?
Yes, it already should be. So thanks for asking. We'll go make sure that it is. By no means do I discourage you from using the NWI data. It's certainly very useful. I just think that the Wetland Registry geodatabase is probably more accurate. So we will make sure that that is up to date, and perhaps that maybe both are available.
Next one is, how long is the permit good for?
Okay, that's another good question. So for 404 and 401 permits, so that Army Corps and water quality certification, it's good for 5 years, or if the Army Corps permit expires prior. So we tie our water quality certifications to the Army Corps permit. And I say that because sometimes you get within a year or within the gap of when the nationwide permits are reissued, and the Army Corps might have a provision in their new nationwide permits that the permit expires sooner than that 5 years. So for a water quality certification, it's going to be the same life as an Army Corps permit, which is typically 5 years. Similarly, for a wetland and stream permit, it's going to be 5 years. So in general, 5 years, unless the Army Corps has some sort of stipulation.
And that is it for the chat box questions. At this juncture, I think we can open it up if anybody has any lingering points they need clarified or any other questions that they would like to ask.
This is James Parks from DEMPET. I had a quick question. You might have mentioned this before. Is the recording of the presentation or the presentation going to be sent out?
I believe the answer to that is yes. We will send it out along with the presentation.
Thank you.
Yeah, it should. The presentation, I think, is actually already available on our website from a few weeks ago when we did it, but I imagine we'll also post the recording on the website too.
Hey Jen, Antonio here. Do you know how are you going to be able to discern, say, by using the database if a site has been already permitted?
You're saying if it has
Like
a
when you
permit?
drop a point. When you drop a point.
No. You won't be, when you drop a point, you won't be able to tell if there's an existing permit for a different project. Maybe that's something we can visit in the future, but it's not available right now.
Okay.
I think if we don't have any questions, we can close it up early. Again, if you do have questions, once you've kind of digested all of this, feel free to contact me and I'm happy to chat.
Yeah, thanks everyone for attending. It's good to see a lot of familiar names out in our audience today. And we
Thank
look
you.
forward to seeing your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody.